not normally the kind of workflow that I have to go through, right? So it really kind of ingrains this end user behavior of taking a step back before they're entering credentials to potentially like some kind of indirect proxy attacker in the middle kind of phishing method, right? So it makes your users more resistant and less susceptible to that type of attack. The second item that we can utilize to just kind of improve our end user behavior and awareness is the custom company branding and Entra ID, right? So what this allows you to do is basically within any Entra ID sign-in pages across M365, we can allow you to place your own custom company branding to replace the Microsoft default Entra ID logo, kind of color scheme, so you can fully customize that, right? And so that really just gives you one extra kind of layer of defense in terms of if an attacker is going to create a mock authentication or sign-in page for that indirect proxy method, they have to take this extra effort to match exactly what you have done with the custom branding. And if your end users do come upon a generic Microsoft sign-in page, they'll maybe take a step back and think, hey, this normally I have my custom Woodgrove sign-in page. Why am I getting a Microsoft sign-in page, right? And so that brings us to I think some of the most important controls that we can use in Entra ID, and some of these will actually directly prevent and stop token replays attacks, right? So the first one is going to be token protection. So token protection is a session control that we can turn on in conditional access that basically will reduce token replay attacks by ensuring that only device-bound sign-in session tokens, like our primary refresh tokens or PRTs, are accepted by Entra ID when applications request access to protected resources, right? So when a user registers a Windows 10 or later device with Microsoft Entra, a PRT is issued and cryptographically bound to that device. This binding ensures that even if a threat actor steals a token, it can't be used from another device, right? With token protection enforced, basically Microsoft Entra validates that only bound sign-in session tokens are used by supported applications, right? So the issue with tokens traditionally is that most of our applications are using something called bearer tokens, right? Where simply having possession of the token is enough to basically grant you access, right? So we don't do any kind of most apps don't do any kind of additional validation, right? So simply having the token grants you access, right? So that means if something gets stolen, there's no additional verification on there. But with Entra ID token protection, we are making sure, or we're moving away from these bearer tokens and switching to bound tokens, right? Where the application is actually looking for proof that that token was issued and bound to the device that we're trying to connect from. So this is a control that you can simply turn on by going to your session controls in conditional access. So as of today, we can enforce token protection policies on Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Teams. It is also supported by many M365 native applications. We do have a pretty comprehensive list in our Microsoft Learn documentation. I would caution customers that when you do turn this on, to make sure that you're only turning this on for the applications that do support it. If you do try to turn this on for certain like SaaS applications, you might inadvertently kind of break something because they do not support only bound tokens. But this is something that we're recommending all customers to turn on for our M365 services. Okay, so the next control that we can use within conditional access and Entra ID is something called continuous access evaluation, right? So one of the historical, I guess, challenges with traditional tokens and access tokens and session tokens, replay tokens, is that they live for a certain lifetime, right? And it's very hard to kind of revoke their tokens very quickly if a critical event happens, right? Such as someone gets fired or they, for example, leave a certain location that you have authorized. For example, in Entra ID, an access token might live anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, right? So you might have to traditionally wait for that token to expire, even if something did change with the end user's state, right? What CAE allows us to do is for applications and services like Exchange Online, SharePoint Teams, and other across MT365, is they can now subscribe to critical Microsoft Entra events, right? So these events are things such as like user accounts being deleted or disabled, password changes, multi-factor authentication changes, if an administrator explicitly revokes refresh tokens, or something like risk being detected by our Entra ID protection, right? And so what happens is they can subscribe to these critical events, and when the critical events happen, they can automatically and immediately revoke your access to these services, right? So for example, I might be a user who is inside the office location, and that might be like my authorized work location. Let's say I leave the office, and now I no longer fall within the kind of authorized location for a certain conditional access policy, let's say to access like Outlook or SharePoint, right? As soon as I leave the office location, the CAE can see that my user status or my conditions have changed, and there will be a critical event generated that can be subscribed to, and now those services can automatically and immediately revoke my access, right? So that's one way that we can kind of much more quickly help with revoking access rather than having to wait for those tokens to expire. Okay, and that brings us to Entra ID protection, right? Which is a really, really powerful tool that basically is going to be applied tenant-wide and is continuously protecting all of our user identities in the background, right? So what happens when we turn on Entra ID protection is this is a tenant level protection that is um, collecting and analyzing signals about all of your user identities, all of their sign-ins, and essentially looking for any type of risk or anything that's out of the ordinary, right? So whenever a user joins Entra ID, um, we're using machine learning to basically kind of learn what are their normal patterns, what locations, what devices they normally sign in from, what time of the day, what kind of applications, right? And then every time they sign in, we're looking at everything about that sign in to determine if there's anything weird or any kind of risk associated with that, right? So what we're doing is dozens and dozens of risk detections, both real time and offline, right? So both at the time of sign in, but also between sign ins, and then correlating to if there's any type of sign in risk or user risk, right? So sign in risk is essentially the risk that we see that a certain sign-in has not been attempted or completed by the actual user identity or the end user. And the user risk is the risk that we see that a certain user identity has been compromised, right? So just some of the detections that we're doing, for sign-in risk and user risk, right? For example, real time, when any user signs in, we're looking at all their sign-in properties, right? So this would be things like location, device ID. We're looking at their token, right? See if there's anything weird with the token, anomalous token, if there's signs that the token may have been replayed or unusual token lifetime. We're also doing detections offline, right? So between sign-ins, looking for things like atypical or impossible travel, right? We're even correlating signals between your users and between users of other tenants to look for signs that like a wider kind of attack, like a password spray attack might have occurred, right? So all these detections, essentially looking for anything kind of out of the ordinary with particular sign-in, out of the ordinary for a user, right? So this can be something that helps us catch whenever if a user possibly has had their token stolen and replayed from another location. That might be something that's caught by either our real-time or our offline detections in terms of the token itself, or if the attacker tries to take that token to a different location, to a different device, tries to sign into an app that we're not usually signing into. These are all things that can be caught by our Entra ID protection tool, right? And so just as an example of what you might see here in your Entra ID protection portal. So this is in our Entra ID administrative center, and we're going to go down on the left blades to a section called the Identity Protection Portal. And here you can see all of your reports for identity protection as it relates to both risky users and risky sign-ins, right? So just in this example, in our demo tenant here, we have our user here, Farman, who has been identified to have medium user risk, right? And so we can go and dive into his user profile, see his recent risky sign-ins. But just from the summary that we're getting from Copilot, we can see exactly why this user is considered risky, right? So he's had a recent risky sign-in with a medium risk where he tried to sign into a Microsoft 365 administrative center. The sign-in IP was this, location was this, the IP, location, and device ID were all unfamiliar to the user, right? So we haven't seen any of these before for this particular user. And on top of that, we have a risk detection for his token, right? We detected an anomalous token, which indicates that there are abnormal characteristics in the token, such as unusual token lifetime or token played from an unfamiliar location, right? And then from here, we can directly either manually action it, right? So we can say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and require that Farman resets his password. I'm going to block him. Or if I think for some reason it's a false positive, I can dismiss. But so we can either manually kind of remediate that, or we can go ahead to our kind of policies here, and we can specify a user risk and sign-in risk policy that says, if my user risk ever reaches a certain threshold or my sign-in risk ever reaches a certain threshold, I'm going to require automatic remediation, right? So that means, hey, if a user risk ever reaches medium or high, I might block that user and I might require password reset. If a certain sign-in reaches a certain threshold, like a medium or high risk, I might implement additional controls such as requiring stronger MFA, right? Or I can also maybe just block access, right? So you can have your blanket user risk and sign-in risk policies here. We can also use these risk evaluations directly in our CA policies, right? So you can say, hey, if I have this very, very high sensitivity application that maybe has sensitive user data or sensitive customer data, I might say that to use or to access this application, I will require that my user risk is only going to be a low. And if my user risk reaches a medium or a high, or my sign-in risk reaches a medium or high, I'm going to just block access for this certain application, right? So we can be very granular in how we're applying these user risks and sign-in risks. Okay, and then the last couple of controls that we're going to talk about, oopsies, went a little bit too far forward, are going to be our trusted locations in Entra ID conditional access, right? So a basic trusted location or physical location would be something like a trusted IP, right? So the most basic example would be you would set up an IP range for, let's say, your office locations, where if you're within the office, you would have different controls, and then once you leave the office, you would have to adhere to stricter controls, such as requiring phishing-resistant MFA, or you might just be blocked altogether, right? So that would be a basic location policy, either with physical IP address or a named location, such as a country. The better version of this is something called a compliant network check, right? Where we basically can use our Entra Secure Web Gateway and SSE solution, or you may have heard something called Global Secure Access, which basically means that all traffic from your end user's devices is being kind of forwarded and monitored through our SSE kind of backend services, which means all of that is evaluated at a user identity level. We can apply policies regardless of whether the user is trying to access public internet resources or private resources. We can apply conditional access policies so that they are required to, let's say, for example, MFA when trying to reach certain resources or trying to RDP to your domain controller. And what you can do with this is you can actually check a box in your conditional access conditions that say, hey, in order to access certain resources, they must be coming from my GSA network, right? So that means that the end user has to have a device that's Entra ID joined. They must have this GSA client installed. We must be evaluating their sign-ins and applying conditional access. If I try to access this app from a non managed device or from a device that doesn't have this configured, then they're going to be blocked, right? So essentially, we can use this as a better location control without having to deal with a lot of the management overhead of like managing your source IPs. Okay. So that brings us to the end of our first section here, which is the controls that we can use in Entra ID to prevent stolen tokens from being used. I'm going to go ahead and pass over to Yasai, and he's going to kind of hop into our second third of this, which is going to be talking all about how we can prevent tokens from being stolen and how we can harden our devices. So Yasai, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're super excited here to kind of talk to you about token protection. It's a very sensitive topic, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about it out there. So we're excited to have you join us and kind of talk through, and really appreciate being here. So as Ryan mentioned, there really is no one size solution to protecting your tokens, right? So the analogy I like to use is, your house has multiple doors, right? So if a bad actor was to try to get into your house, first they'll check the front door. If that's closed, they'll try to go through the back door. Well, do you think they just stop if that happens? No, usually they'll check side doors, they'll check side mirrors, they'll find a way to get into your environment. So the the point here is that in theory, really, you have to protect each and every door, each and every entry into your environment. So obviously, the first thing it starts with is always identity, right? Identity is the first way that they try to log in. And I also like to use another analogy that, hackers don't try to hack in, they log in, right? So they try to use your identity to log in as you, because that's the easiest way to get in, right? So Ryan mentioned a lot of great points on how to protect your tokens through a lot of different capabilities in Entra ID. So today from my end, I'm gonna talk to you about how to harden your devices. And for customers, especially using Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, you can leverage a lot of the power and capabilities of Defender for Endpoint to really minimize that risk. I'll never use the analogy of preventing risk, right? Because no matter what you do, you can't 100% prevent anything, right? But you can absolutely minimize and reduce that risk. And using Defender for Endpoint and a lot of the powerful capabilities, you can minimize that risk on the device level. And that's what I'll talk to you about today. So a couple of things is, enabling the Defender real-time protection, enabling Defender's cloud protection. These are core capabilities, and I'll talk heavily about that as we move forward. Enabling network protection, what type of protection that will provide. And I'll have a demo coming up that'll actually show you some of these in action. So we'll show you things like network protection in action and how it can prevent, let's say, a malicious sign-on page from even opening on the end user's clients, right? We'll talk about tamper protection, what that does for you, and how that prevents you from turning off some of these capabilities. And I'll talk to you about that. Also talk about creating a compliance policy in Intune, how Intune plays a role in here, and how to push these settings and configurations through Intune. And you can also bring your own threat intelligence to enrich the database as well. So first thing, and as I mentioned, we'll talk about, Defender for Endpoint. So Defender for Endpoint provides a lot of powerful capabilities, from vulnerability management, attack surface reduction, your endpoint detection and response, next generation protection. I talked about real-time protection, cloud protection, a lot of core capabilities that it brings into your environment. So we'll talk about some of these shortly as well. Now, Defender for Endpoint can really provide you that protection across your devices. Now that works for Windows devices. If you have Mac OS devices, Linux, iOS or Android devices, Defender for Endpoint can really provide all that core capabilities on your endpoints to provide you that protection. And the greatest part about all this is for customers, especially leveraging Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, you have this as part of your license. You have this protection. So you can really implement it. There's ways to implement it even to start in passive mode. So you can see some of this power in action, and you can pilot it in active mode as well. So I don't want to go too into the weeds of, Defender for Endpoint enabling and pilot, but just want to kind of point that out there for, for customers who are not aware maybe that you have this core capability with your existing licensing. Defender for Endpoint really brings you that power and brings you that control on your endpoints. And we'll talk about some of these and see some of these in actions as we move forward. So I mentioned next generation protection, real-time protection, right? So Defender for Endpoint uses, behavioral-based real-time protection. What that means is it's not necessarily dependent on a scan, right? Your typical AV needs to run a scan every so often, right? And says, oh, I detected a virus malware. Well, that malware could have been running on your machine for a long time, right? Having protection and having scheduled scans and protection is great. But what if there's a malware, active malware that just got installed on your machine? You clicked on a link and something ran that you weren't aware of, that you had no idea. Maybe a PowerShell script run, maybe it was file-based or fileless. It can basically protect you in real time, right? That's kind of the core capability of it, right? And it can stop malicious activity from whether it's a trusted or an untrusted application. So these are very, very core capabilities that you want to make sure that are enabled. And we'll talk about coming up shortly tamper protection and how tamper protection can make sure that these settings are actually enabled, and also to prevent somebody from turning this off. And because obviously, bad actor gets into your environment, like imagine a bad actor getting into your house. What's the first thing they'll try to do? They'll try to find your alarm and try to silence your alarm, right? They'll try to power things off, or, they'll try to go to your, power meter and try to turn your power off. Why do they do that? Because they want their traces to be undetected, right? That's where things like tamper protection can help minimize that. And we'll talk about that coming up shortly as well. So network protection adds another layer of protection that helps prevent, these bad sites and these malicious sites from even opening on your endpoints, right? Because imagine you get in, I'll have a demo shortly of a user getting an email and has a link to a sign-in page. And, Ryan earlier talked about the company branding, and I can't harp the importance of having company branding because that makes your users aware of the sign-in page. If they see a sign-in page that doesn't have my company logo, I shouldn't sign in, or I shouldn't just click through and sign in, and we'll see that coming up shortly. Network protection basically allows you to prevent that page from opening. So essentially, you'll prevent that. And there's ways in Defender for Endpoint supports what's called web content filtering and indicators to basically block certain sites. And you can also have categories where it'll prevent those sites from opening. So network protection provides a core capability built into Defender for Endpoint, and using network protection along with Defender Smart Screen to prevent those sites from even opening. And we'll kind of see that in action coming up. So I talked about tamper protection, right? Tamper protection, I really, really enjoy this feature. For any customer who's actively on Defender for Endpoint using Defender XDR, if you don't have tamper protection enabled either through Defender for Endpoint settings or through an Intune policy, you absolutely should get this enabled in your environment, because this is really the preventive mechanism to prevent somebody from turning off all these core capabilities that Defender for Endpoint can provide, right? So the analogy I used earlier, imagine that you had your alarm in your house in a special lockbox that nobody can actually open. Well, if a bad actor gets into your environment, there's no way for them to find that alarm and silence it. So it'll still keep ringing, which will essentially alert the cops, and then eventually they'll be like, okay, I need to get out of this house because I can't really do anything because somebody's going to come and catch me. Same thing, right? Tamper protection will then prevent somebody from going and turning off real-time protection. They want to stop their traces. They want to stop their tracks, right? So that's where tamper protection can really prevent all of those from being turned off. And also, it's for the end user as well. So if somebody has a local admin on the machine, you don't want them going and turning off real-time protection. Now, there are exceptions. There's things like troubleshooting mode and things along those lines, right? That you can enable to test certain components, but tamper protection really is to prevent. And how this plays a role, you might ask, well, how does this prevent token theft, right? Well, if malware were to run on your machine, you want to make sure that the intent of that malware is to somehow steal that token, right? To somehow run something to basically pull that token and replay it. Now, Ryan mentioned earlier about token protection. There's also user risk and sign-in risk. Yes, even if they were to steal that token, they try to replay it, there's other protection in place to prevent that. But just because you have one doesn't necessarily mean you don't have the other, right? So you still want the malware to be stopped. You still don't want, just because you have protection on the identity, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to encourage a token from being stolen, right? So tamper protection and the Defender for Endpoint, you want to make sure that that protection protects that token, and if malware is to run, that it's prevented from running. So you prevent the token from even being stolen in the first place, right? So it's a core capability, and like I mentioned, if you don't have this enabled, make sure that's something that you do look at enabling across your tenant. So now, I talked about Intune. So, these are all great features. And, I'll also talk about like attack surface reduction rules coming up. So how to deploy these, right? So for customers who are using Intune and managing the devices, even if you're not managing the devices in Intune, there's ways to use the power of Intune in combination with Defender for Endpoint to roll out all these settings and configurations, whether it's AV settings, disk encryption. There's other things like BitLocker to harden your devices, firewall, app control settings, right? There's a lot of settings that I talked about enabling. Well, how do you deploy these en masse? That's where you use the power of Intune and the endpoint security capabilities with Intune to roll these out on your machines. And there's an important point here about auto enrolling your devices in Defender for Endpoint. Sounds like a very small item, but to me, it's very, very important because as you're onboarding new devices into your environment, you want to make sure you automate the deployment to Defender for Endpoint, right? You don't want to depend on manual onboarding scripts, because what happens if scripts don't run, something doesn't happen, now all of a sudden you provision 5 or 10 machines that you thought were on Defender for Endpoint, you have all these protection, you have all these policies, well, they never onboarded. So you want to make sure that you automate that. So that's where you use the power of Intune to automate that onboarding to Defender for Endpoint so that your machines get protection on day one. They get all of these endpoint security policies. They get your BitLocker, your firewall, your AV policies, things like, your scan settings, turning on, some of these, real-time protection, cloud protection, network protection, right? So all of these settings that I talked about enabling, you could automate enabling all of that through different policies, and that's where you use the power of Intune to kind of deploy that across. So I talked about attack surface reduction rules. So this is a critical component inside of endpoint security. So if you are using Defender for Endpoint today and you don't have any ASR rules, I would highly recommend that you look into that, because ASR rules really minimize that attack surface, right? There's a lot of things that it does, things like a lot of bad actors, right? They'll try to ingest things into Office apps like executable content, macros. They'll try to ingest child process in an Adobe Reader, vulnerable applications that they try to run things on, right? So that's where attack surface reduction rules kind of prevent that on the device level. These are core capabilities to really minimize that attack surface, right? So a lot of great settings in their endpoint security. I won't go into timing to each and every single one, but these are all kind of examples, email rules, script rules, prevent lateral movement. So they're built into endpoint security in Intune. These are ASR rules. I would highly recommend, though, if you don't have these enabled today, last thing you want is to enable all these settings and deploy to all your devices and break things, right? So to kind of minimize that, and becoming kind of a consultant background, right? We deal with customers where we're helping them roll this out, and we try to proceed with caution, right? Naturally. So you want to basically, when you do enable these, enable it on small, some pilot devices to make sure nothing actually breaks, and then slowly deploy it across to your other endpoints, because you definitely don't want to start rolling it out on your endpoints and then realize something in there is maybe breaking a process that you're currently doing and then having to backtrack. So just kind of keep that in mind across this and anything else that I kind of mentioned. If you don't have things enabled, start with a small scale before you kind of roll it out across your mass devices. So very powerful. I've seen that, this is a very underutilized at times where ASR rules are not present. So this truly helps minimize that attack surface. So if you don't have any ASR rules today, I would highly recommend looking into it and deploying it. Now, how to use this, right? So I talked about all of these features. I talked about all these core capabilities, and, Ryan alluded earlier to compliant device and how to do that compliant check, right? So in order for you to even get to a point where you can require a user to be on a compliant device, you have to first roll out all these settings. If you're going to require, real-time protection to be enabled on the device, well, you can't depend on the user to manually enable that on their client. You have to force that to be enabled. That's why it's very important that you make sure that you first use Intune, you use endpoint security policies to roll out all of these features and capabilities onto the endpoint before you then require a compliant device. That's when, at that point, you are ready to create that compliance policy in Intune to basically look for these. Once you see that devices are reporting back as compliant, then at that point, then you can use the conditional access policies, again, based on device, based on different conditions, to require a compliant device, right? And I would highly suggest to, again, anytime you're dealing with conditional access policies, to first put it in report only mode so you can see what it's going to do before you actually roll it out. So it's very, very important, because otherwise the last thing you want, of course, is to lock out your users, because, obviously with conditional access policies, if you implement it and something is done incorrectly, the last thing you want is to lock every user out. Then you have to go to Microsoft support to try to unlock it. Unfortunately, that has happened, and that can continue to happen. And Microsoft's done a great job of building certain things to kind of throw you a warning on the bottom saying, are you sure? Can you exclude your account from this and things like that to prevent that? But, it's very important that, all of these things are in place. You have all the policies rolled out, and then you can reinforce the compliance check on the end user. So, this kind of highlights the power of conditional access, the conditions, the controls, things like that. I won't go too in depth into how to configure this, but as you can see, there's a check that says require device to be marked as compliant. So that basically comes from Intune. And then in Intune, how that plays with Defender for Endpoint is basically you can also require the device machine risk score to be at a certain point. So if there is a device compromise, as an example, and Defender for Endpoint notices that there's something on the device has been compromised, malware has been run, it will raise the machine risk score on that endpoint. That will then report back to Intune, and Intune will say, okay, this machine risk score is high. And Ryan alluded to continuous access evaluation in real time, even if you had just authenticated and your token hasn't been updated. If your machine risk score is raised and your device is no longer compliant, and you have a CA policy that requires you to be on a compliant device, for your protection, it will stop you from authenticating. It will basically prevent you from authenticating to Microsoft 365. It'll say you have to re-authenticate, and even if you try to do that, it'll tell you that you're not on a compliant device. I have a quick demo that I will show you shortly that will showcase that. So in this first demo, I talked about network protection. So user received an email. As you can see, they clicked on a link and they try to open the link. Network protection said, I'm sorry, I can't let you open this link and you can see Microsoft Security blocked that from actually happening, right? So now, what happens if you don't have network protection? This is a second link. Now, you notice here that this is an actual Microsoft sign-in page. So we talked earlier about, company branding. This is what my sign-in page should have looked like with the branding, but the actual sign-in link that you got doesn't have branding. So this should spark a red flag to the end user that, and I'm going to pause here real quick so I can show you this next video, but that should warn the user that, hey, the sign-in page that you got has a Microsoft logo, but we should have had a company branded sign-in page, right? So if you don't see that, just make sure you be alarmed. So network protection in that case prevented that user on that first sign-in page. But the second one, there was no protection. Let's say hypothetically, there was no network protection, so the user did get the sign-in page. So just make sure that, again, company branding, if you're not doing it today, to make sure to enable it to prevent that. So in the second demo, this is where device is no longer compliant. Something triggered this device to be non-compliant. So the user went to your Outlook client, they were authenticating 2 minutes ago, and all of a sudden in real time, CA kicked in and said, sorry, your device is no longer compliant. I can't let you connect. Now, there could be different reasons, again, why that happened on that device. So, depending on what it is, but so in that case, the whole point is that to show you that once the device is no longer compliant, in real time, CA kicked in and blocked that user from signing in. So really powerful component. That's where everything comes together, right? All the protection you applied, conditional access all kind of came in, and then you basically had that event where the user can't authenticate. Once they're, compliant again, then they'll be able to connect back. Same thing in real time, they'll be able to connect back and authenticate to their services. So to kind of summarize everything, right? So Ryan talked about, preventing use of stolen tokens, how to use Entra ID to basically prevent this, there's different mechanisms on the identity side to prevent the use of stolen tokens. I talked a lot about, minimizing the risk of token theft, how to harden your devices, right? It's really important that, as I mentioned, kind of using the analogy, you want to try to prevent it from all angles, right? Both at the identity level and at the device level. But let's say that you had a token theft, assume breach, right? The last step. Let's say the token theft did happen. You can use the power of Microsoft Sentinel and all the alerting to basically monitor for token theft and use power of Microsoft Sentinel for customers who are using Sentinel. You can pull all those different alerts from Defender XDR and try to monitor and investigate if token theft did occur, right? Because you don't really know. It could have already happened. Maybe you didn't have some of these components in place today. So it's important that you monitor for that. Look at using the power of Microsoft Sentinel to monitor for that. See if there's token theft occurred in the environment so that you know what to do next, right? So it's very important that along with preventing it, along with minimizing it, to always detect and investigate, because like I said, as much as you do to minimize risk, there's no 100% way to reduce risk because it could still happen. So it's very, very important that you don't just assume that, hey, we prevented it, we minimize it, we don't need to monitor it. You absolutely do continuously to kind of monitor to prevent that. So, these are all layers of defense because, just as important it is as to prevent it and minimize it, you still want to make sure that you detect it moving forward. So just a quick little info about us. My name is Isai Chujan from Mervanti, CTO here. We have different specializations across modern work, identity access management, cybersecurity. We work with a lot of different industries to, cross device security, securing modern work, identity and access management, collaboration, M&As, endpoint management. So across the whole Microsoft stack. So I've personally been in the Microsoft space for over 12, 13 years. I've seen a lot with migrations, where it was to where it came today, how security focused Microsoft is. They have a lot of great tools and capabilities built in. So customers using E3 or even E5, a lot of core capabilities, a lot of great things. So if you're not maximizing it, if you're looking ways to maximize your licensing, get all of these components, save on costs. We're here to help you as well. So our email address is there and our website. If you have any questions or would like to reach out, please feel free. We'll be happy to help you deploy these and kind of put these in use. So really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much for listening in. I hope this was informative for you. I will provide you some great information, and we'll look forward to you on the next webinar. So I'll pass it back to the team for some final comments and additional next steps. So really appreciate it.
Thank you, Asai and Ryan. This was a really great session, kind of looking at an extended look on how to better protect, detect, and investigate token theft. We're looking for improvements, so we'll like to take the moment to, whenever you receive an email with a quick survey, that will be sent out to you as a follow-up. Your feedback is very useful because it'll help future briefings. Feel free to also suggest topics that you would like for us to cover in future webinars. And if you have any follow-up questions that were not answered during the briefing, please feel free to add them through there as well. If you want to learn more about what we covered today, we encourage you to reach out to your account team to provide personalized recommendations and next steps, as well as broker a conversation with Asai and his team at Revanti. Whether you want to dive a little bit deeper into the technical aspects with one of our security solutions engineer like Ryan, or just basically start navigating on how to get started, please don't hesitate to reach out to your account executive or your security specialist for more assistance. Also, we want to encourage every customer to join our Customer Connection Program, or CCPs. These CCPs provide a unique opportunity to connecting with Microsoft engineering and other customers. We currently have teams that are well established around different communities, which will include Purview, Entra, Intune, as well as various of the security products around Defender. But that's it for us today. I want to again thank Ryan, Asai, and the rest of the team for helping us support this event. And thank you for joining us. With that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye and hope to see you again in the next briefing. Thank you.